It's my big pleasure to introduce one of my dear friends, Divya Diwedi, who's a role model for lots of us, because when you talk to her, everything is possible, and there we have to fight all the time, and you give us the energy to do so. So just to introduce you to the rest of the people, Divya is a philosopher and a narratologist based in India. She is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Literature at the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi, and also member of the steering committee of the IIT Delhi Sorbonne University Integrated Health Campus since 2023. And this is where we met, actually. Her research is concerned with the ontology of the literary, the addressee function, post-colonial racism, and psychoanalysis. And since November 2020, Divya is also co-founded the open access multilingual journal Philosophy, World, Democracy, together with Jean-Luc Nancy, Shaj Monaj, Achille Mbembe, and Mireille Delmas-Marty. It's my great honor to give her the stage to do the closing note of this event.
Good evening, everyone. It's a great honor to give the closing note for this fabulous conference, thanks to Violeta Zujovic and the Institut du Cerveau. We've been gathered here from so many disciplines and so many parts of the world to collectively reflect on the power of inclusion, this title, which for me is both philosophical and political. And it even expresses the necessary connection or relation between philosophy and politics. Diversity and inclusion is a well-known phrase in universities, in other institutions, in both the public and the private sectors. It is a new social imperative which seeks to address the conscious as well as unconscious biases that have structured our societies. This new social imperative is frequently described today in some parts of the world as a North American invention that is being imported or even imposed, including in its very name, diversity and inclusion, upon the rest of the world through various international normalizing instruments such as funding. This narrative of an imposition allows us to forget the other histories of successful struggles for inclusion that produced policy change in other parts of the world, as though this all happened in North America. And of these struggles, if I may mention just the most important ones, it was the fight against apartheid in South Africa, which the philosopher Jacques Derrida called racism's last word. I have some trouble with his description, but it's very important. And he said that apartheid was the only one on the scene that dares to say its name and to present itself for what it is, a legal defiance taken on by homo politicus, a juridical racism, and a state racism. My trouble is simply that I don't think apartheid is the last word, as though all of racism is behind us, but Derrida is right. But I would give other examples as well. The fight for proportional representation, which led to the reservations policy in India. Ravinder Kaur, my colleague from IIT Delhi, spoke of it eloquently earlier today. But also the older fights of women's equality at home and on the factory floors, in workplaces, in industrializing societies in Europe in the early 20th century. These are memories we cannot lose. The conditions that would foster gender-based inclusion were outlined also in with astonishing prescience by Simone de Beauvoir in The Second Sex. Today, geopolitical crimes committed in regions like Afghanistan, in Palestine, have undone the pre-existing diversity and relative inclusivity of gender in educational and professional life, and has returned women to prisons of one kind or another. So there are both critical and constructive lessons from all these histories and memories, and they remind us that exclusion and what I could call as the opposite of diversity, a monoversity perhaps, these are practiced in institutions as well as cultural and institutional memories. And these histories also remind us that while diversity and inclusion is an urgent agenda in what is lazily called the global north, so for instance, the universities of the global north, which do appear to give us a template, the inclusion of non-white and non-heteronormative people in various white Eurocentric public spaces is not the only social imperative. Many of the spaces we discussed today did seem to belong in what is called the global north, which is a new synonym perhaps of white. The heterogeneous societies of South Africa or India have equally, if not greater, exclusions to fight against, because in these societies, the excluded people have been the majority, unlike the minority in the global north. To the point that inclusion seems like a feeble term for the order of change that remains to be accomplished in the whole world. It is to accentuate the silent social imperative which we must experience all over the world, and not simply in or against the global north, that I add the word equality alongside diversity and inclusion in my title. So I want to speak about equality with an example which is from my own society. We are aware, and the pandemic acutely reminded us, that the majority of the world is suffering. We are aware that this suffering was and is preventable in its immediate context, since it is not a destiny, but it is a state of being whose persistent conditions have been secured by the regularities that compose our world. Institutionalized inequalities between peoples and communities, systemic reproduction of the deprivation of goods, and the degradation of the environments that sustain life. The present arrangement of the components of our world, of a globalized world, are not within the grasp of individuals or even individual institutions. They have been maintained by massive technological corporations, by economic organizations, and then by nation states which conduct what I could call their crony function, by deploying the hoaxes of national, racialized, and religious identities in various cases, but also of their post-colonial victimhood in other cases. And this last example of this kind of post-colonial victimhood have withdrawn from the function of the state, the last meaning the nation state in its crony function, has withdrawn from the function of the state which was to look after people. They have instead perfected a murderous population politics of discrimination and legal as well as illegal persecution, which they perpetrate on citizens, on the dispossessed, and on refugees with impunity. So that I'd like to echo an old favorite musician of mine, and ask, what is so far about the far right? Specific powers which are available to a few men and a few institutions of economy, judicial institutions, legislation, and technology have precluded the majority from the collective assessing of the means to prevent this widespread and acute suffering. That includes climate change. The existence of these regularities renders all thought of an ontological precariousness or of a historical destiny of being unfolding through Western metaphysics as ontotheology, as Heidegger said, and many of his followers in European philosophy echoed, as well as all thought of evil as a theological problem. It all sounds to be a mockery of the suffering of the majority people of the world. These are not ontological, but political and philosophical matters. In public discourse, which is no longer kept at bay outside the university gates, but it is rushing in, and most recently even on horseback, if you know what I mean, there is a growing allophobia and a porophobia, by which I mean a hatred of the other and a hatred of mixing. We can sense an urgency in the voices of refusal to acknowledge that the world today belongs to everyone, and it connects everyone everywhere in reciprocal and yet unequal relations with each other. And one could even say that the pandemic and the ecological problems of today have contributed something to philosophy, sadly and belatedly, which is the obligation to think the world and the demos in a new way, and therefore to initiate a thinking of what I could call the democracy of the world. In my recent work with Shaj Mohan, we defined philosophy as the creation of freedom alongside art, and we defined politics as the fight for these freedoms. I will take the liberty of reinterpreting the question of this conference by speaking of the power of inclusion as the power to think and practice equality, diversity, and inclusion. Conceptually, diversity bespeaks a celebration of differences, while equality might suggest an equalizing reduction of what is similar. And perhaps that is why we hear the word diversity more than we hear the word equality. But I would say that equality concerns two things. First, the equal dignity, opportunity, and availability of conditions under which diverse people are included and can flourish. And secondly, equality concerns the very availability to all of the power to institute the conditions in which diverse peoples, cultures, talents are included and are enabled by those resources which must be held in common by all members of society. According to Robert Bernasconi, who can be said to be the father of the disciplinary field called critical philosophy of race, father in quotes, but I'm doing some psychoanalytical work, so I'm permitting myself this shorthand. I'm going to quote his remark on Frantz Fanon, of whom he is one of the specialists. Fanon's conclusion was that even if one were, contrary to his own beliefs, to attribute a part of a patient's problem to her own constitution, in the case of mental health, her alienation was aggravated by predetermined circumstances, and until those circumstances had been addressed, any improvement in her illness was going to be limited. So the milieu, the space of improvement is perhaps not the clinic, it's the outside of the clinic. And now I would like to speak about my context. There were 35,950 suicides by students between 2019 and 2021, according to the statistics of our government. The lack of socioeconomic data about them is not merely negligent. In elite educational institutions that were discussed earlier, especially of engineering and management and medicine, 122 students killed themselves between 2014 and 2021. And of these 122, 68, that is more than 50%, were from the lower caste communities. The demographic distribution of this exploitative and exclusionary relation will make the matter starkly clear. The oppressing upper castes form less than 10% of our country's population. They are a minuscule minority. And the oppressed lower castes, including the untouchables, form more than 90% of the population. From this statistics, which still awaits a proper national census to be made public, we could surmise that the majority of student suicides of India are caste-inflicted, given in any case that the lower castes are the majority. So in the haunting words of one of the, it's hard to say this, but one of the famous suicide notes of a Dalit student, PhD student in 2016, never was a man treated as a mind in India. I think this phrase could summarize a lot of what we could say about psychology and philosophy in India. Why is a man not treated as a mind? I would say that a mind is capable of interacting with the components of the immediate and the mediate world, of thinking and imagining this world and its components otherwise. The mind is capable of introducing change in the functions and regularities of the components. But caste as a civilizational principle comprehends people's lives and it impacts their physical and mental health by reducing them to their immediate identity and their nearest possibility. This again is a phrase from this acute suicide note, the nearest identity and immediate possibility. Immediate identity is the attribution of caste to a person because of the parents to whom she is born. Caste is what I would call hypophysical. It's not metaphysical, it's not physical, but hypophysical since it holds value to be, that is superior or inferior, to be intrinsic to human nature. And caste institutionally ascribes a graded value to a person predefined as having an immutable nature by birth, born as upper or lower because of the parents they are born to. So intelligence, worth, beauty, fruits of action and punishments, success and failure in life, but also in the next life, in short, value, is held to be transmitted in the nature of the born body. The hypophysics of caste is inimical to treating man as a mind because the mind can and will dissociate the values soldered into birth and nature, and the mind will re-evaluate it. It will produce dissociations. It can dissociate the racializing predefinition that caste finds in the child so that other destinies can be discovered and cultivated in her. The mind will also dissociate groups from their functional isolation in prefixed occupational skillology of caste, and it can invent new functions for people. So a sweeper might dream and might actually become a doctor. The mind can invent new functions for people, for spaces, for objects, so desacralizing spaces that had been sacralized according to the logic of purity and pollution. It can also produce new functions for objects outside of caste prescriptions. It can create new social and political conditions, new laws and institutions, including the reservations policy, to materialize the newly imagined functions. This is what Shaj and I call the polynomia of the mind, the capacity for being legislated according to new and diverse, that is, poly laws. The mind is polynomial because it approaches the world as capable of being regulated under multiple laws. It is not a world confined under one eternal law for which the best known Sanskrit translation would be Sanatana Dharma. That is the name for the Hindu religion that is being proposed today, or a slightly older name, but being peddled more aggressively today. So the mind would be opposed to anything that is eternal, archaeoteleological, or Sanatan. In the famous speech in 1936 titled The Annihilation of Caste, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was a thinker, jurist, economist, a sociologist, and also the architect of the modern Indian constitution, he noted the persistence of a fundamental characteristic of society in India. At the very moment when the elites, the upper castes of India, were debating the form that our new nation would take, which it would in 1947. And he observed, Hindu society as such does not exist. It is only a collection of castes. That is the reason why Hindus cannot be said to form a society or a nation. And of course, he went on to explain that these were not simply a diversity of castes. This was a hierarchy of castes. The criteria for forming a society, according to Ambedkar, was to have something in common rather than simply to have similar things. And the most prominent similar thing, which is claimed, but I think is not in common amongst all these castes, is apparently Hindu religion. And this is why Ambedkar referred to the antisocial spirit of the so-called Hindu society. Such criteria specify for us the true meaning of community, a word that has also been thought deeply by Jean-Luc Nancy, Giorgio Agamben, Roberto Esposito, and others. And Ambedkar took inspiration from the French Revolution and from the European constitutions of his time and used the word fraternity for it, but fraternity not in having to do with the blood of brothers or brothers of blood, but rather, and I quote, an ideal society should be mobile, full of channels for conveying or communicating a change taking place in one part to the others. In an ideal society, there should be many interests consciously communicated and shared. There should be a variety of modes of contact with other modes of association. This is fraternity, which is only another name for democracy. And we could understand this in the following way. Having in common the polynomia of all members of society, having in common the common project of sustaining everyone's polynomia as freedom. An ideal society should be mobile with varied modes of contact so that many interests, there's a repeat. So it means enabling conditions for the free choice of education, of occupation, of life partners and lovers, the free creation of enterprises, and also a freedom for identifications of friends, of families, of genders, rather than the reproduction of caste identifications and caste belonging. So the ceremonial society of caste, as of any other racialized society or apartheid, or any form of descent-based discrimination, seeks to decrease individual as well as collective polynomia. That is to say, collective freedom to legislate new laws. Caste and race blindness is a form, therefore, of what I would call, following Freud, or borrowing from Freud, Verneinung, that is to say, a denial of something that we all know exists, right inside us and outside us. Caste is not something that is difficult to conceptualize. Here I have a small difference of opinion with Ravinder. I think there's a deliberate forgetting and a suppression of the questions of caste and race in India. For example, and here I would like to come to the term diversity, and what in diversity does not capture the question and the urgency of equality. One of the philosophy scholars of India who is quite influential in discussions of secularism and tolerance, Rajiv Bhargava, presents caste hierarchy as, and I quote, vertical diversity. While he calls the existence of many religions and many denominations in India a horizontal diversity. And suddenly this geometrical way of qualifying diversity makes the word hierarchy disappear. It makes the problem of inequality disappear. All we have are diverse forms of diversity, which sounds very affirmative. So vertical and horizontal diversity for Bhargava together comprise a distinctly Indian brand of secularism, which should serve as a model of tolerance in the world. Vertical diversity, therefore, invisibilizes the problem of inequality, and in the light of the caste civilization, we can sense that diversity without egalitarian and democratic imperatives is not only tokenistic, but worse, it is a means of Verneinung or denial. In somewhat a similar way, inclusion too can be a broad and vague term, and I will give another example precisely at the level of religion. Today, Hinduism is the officially recognized term for the majority population of India, and its content is posited as the ancient practices and texts from the Vedas onwards, subsequent sacred rule books like the Dharmashastras and the Sanskrit epics, the authors, the possessors, and the practitioners of this old corpus were always the upper castes whose fundamental self-definition was exclusive. That is, they defined themselves, including with the use of the word Aryan, by distinguishing and excluding all the other castes as lower. They were kept out, and their denigration was the premise also for their availability for exploitation. In other words, exclusion came along with the form of inclusion through exploitation, but exclusion at the level of a shared social reality and education. The voices of the Dalits, the tribal people, the religious minorities are today mediated through this very consensus that India is a Hindu majority country. The Dalit point of view in India is being called anti-national and extremist because the Dalit ways of life do not follow the so-called mainstream Hindu practices, including eating beef and praying to deities whom the northwestern upper caste Indians, who consider themselves to be Aryan and Hindu, call demons. So the lower caste religions, practices, and gods are termed demons, asura, with reference even today to the identity of Vedic Aryans. All this while the upper castes keep their religion itself strictly to themselves, including temples and other domains of sociality. And there have always been violent retaliations by the upper castes, even when the lower castes attempted to use the public roads and water tanks outside of upper caste temples. So whatever the ancient religion of the upper castes may be and may be called, it could not have also been the religion of the majority population of lower castes, unless we are going to call exploitation a form of inclusion by a perverted use of language. There was neither religion nor society in common between the upper and the lower castes. This deeply structural exclusion by means of inclusion is hidden behind the decolonial imperative, which elite Indians impose on institutions in the West. And it works there to protect their interests. Decoloniality is not a solution to the problem of caste inequality because this problem is not a colonially originated one. I could even call it the oldest racism in the world, which still survives and does so with cultural pride. And this cultural pride continues to inform the research of decolonial social scientists like Ashish Nandi, who asserted against Eurocentrism. That was my indirect point with respect to Anna. The hypophysics of caste was also at the origins of the race of racism and of racialization in Europe. And this is something of which the facts are known, but the understanding remains repressed or unacknowledged. There is not simply an analogy between caste and race. There is actually a homology between the two, and all the biologists will immediately understand that I'm using it in the sense of having common origins. Caste was among the origins of race theory in India, like a common ancestor. The Aryan-speaking Brahmins and their legacy across centuries came to Europe from Brahmanical texts, even if in badly translated forms, especially the Vedic texts. And it also came from the then contemporary Indians who displayed their caste to the incoming missionaries, travelers, and colonialists. European race makers came to construct themselves as the same Aryan people or of the same Aryan people. And this can be seen in the anthropology, both racial and cultural, of thinkers like Herder as well as Kant, who are supposed to be on two sides of the cosmopolitanism, multiculturalism debate, but were equally concerned with this Aryan identity. But why was caste at the source of some of the most influential race theories, which eventually resulted in the Holocaust and accentuated anti-Semitism in Europe, as they are doing once again today? It was because caste was the evidence that large groups could be dominated and exploited, but also excluded through the self-designation of superiority by the oppressing group. This was a poetic genius where the oppressing group had found a word, a name for themselves, and that name was nothing but Aryan, which means noble and superior, and therefore is a supremacist classifier. There was no other example of a group of comparable antiquity and durability, which unreservedly designated themselves as the other who was also the master. I once again use very famous words from Frantz Fanon. Caste was the empirical and textual resource for Europeans, as it showed that large groups could be dominated but also excluded through a self-designating superiority supplied by Brahmanical texts. And therefore, rather than being a colonial construct, as many recent historians have argued in the past decades, caste is the oldest racism. It finds new ways to mask itself and sufficiently transform itself so that it can be perpetuated under modern conditions where there are new pressures for democracy and egalitarianism. Generations of European philologists and then anthropologists and linguists, Indologists like Humboldt, Dumézil, Louis Dumont, but also social scientists like Ashish Nandy and Rajiv Bhargava would continue to study the upper caste part of India, but present it as though it was the whole of India. And that is where the indigenous or native position of decolonial thinking in India derives. Caste blindness is therefore the biggest obstacle to the efforts for inclusion. And while efforts have been made and they are successful, I agree with Ravinder here, there is an active resistance that is growing in its intensity and translates into the current political crisis in our country. So it is not to be undermined, it is only growing stronger. And it has deeply shaped the identity of such top schools of excellence in merit by an exclusive upper caste evaluation. My last words are for philosophy and its relation to politics. If I can very broadly define culture, it is a set of regularities in which processes and practices repeat by passing through specific objects, bodies, and genres of things. If we can speak of philosophy being a culture, including a university culture, a Western culture, a more than Western culture, today, at least, philosophical culture would be continuous with the academic culture and its co-articulations in the wider public sphere. And this poses very serious problems for the existence and for any optimism regarding philosophy in my part of the world and in what I could call the rest of the world, the West and the rest. Hence, the exclusion from philosophy of women, of minorities, of lower castes is continuous with their exclusion in the rest of the world, in those institutions where power and control are exercised. But while we have sufficiently talked about the conditions of inclusion for women in a traditionally masculine discipline like philosophy, but also science, as was said earlier, we have talked about all male, all white canons and syllabi, fellowships, maternity and paternity leaves, childcare, tenure, casual work. There are two problems, an old one and a new one, which confronts us. The old problem is that we have not talked with the same intensity and commitment about the old racisms which survive even apartheid, such as caste, whose effects in Europe have been at least 3 to 4 centuries old and are not going away anytime. If we look at the networks of the far-right movements today. The new problem is the place of philosophy itself is fast becoming marginal to the most consequential discussions about the very world in which they were traditionally excluded, people were excluded from mattering. Today, it's the global techno corporations and financial institutions who make the most important decisions about our lives. The former even lays exclusive claim to thinking by redefining thinking as computation and by seeking aggressively to transfer the thinking function to artificial intelligence. Then the freedom to generate and share new possibilities is inseparable from our sense of the material ways in which regularities that arrange our lives are made and can be unmade. This sense that we can imagine ways of unmaking the present arrangement of regularities obliges us to fight for them, and politics is nothing other than this fight. This brings me back to my definition. Politics is the fight to change the regularities of the world and to open up the polynomia of individuals and collectives. Democracy is the other name for this responsibility which is for all of us and by all of us for the whole world. We share it with each other. In our epoch, where all flows and all problems are connecting, the whole world, the responsibility as well as democracy cannot be regionalized, neither in the past nor in the future. Instead, we are now concerned with the democracy of the world so that the people of the world, who are all affected by the globally impacting decisions of technocratic corporations, but who have never been consulted, can finally participate in arranging their lives. Philosophy must think what it means to be a people without being determined in the last instance, not in the first, but in the last instance, not being determined by place, locality, language, ancestry, and traditions. A people of the world that can think on behalf of each other. Philosophy itself has right up until now been thinking about itself in terms of regions such as the West and identities such as the East. It has been the opposition to this way of thinking has also not found another possibility than what I could call ethno-philosophy, that is to say, a rejection of philosophy as Western, and then the raising of various other thought traditions as museums of thinking from the past. The primary meaning of being a philosopher in India, according to me, is finding the means to displace the oppressive weight of the caste order, which still arranges all social life, that successfully instrumentalizes all new technologies and forms of life, whether feudalist, socialist, or capitalist. It perpetuates its own racializing and segregating logic. To do philosophy, then, must mean to invent a new meaning of being and living together, inventing new freedoms, inventing new ways of relating to and as the world. Man has been called the animal that can make promises, that can give its word, and can, by means of promises, plans, and actions, bind itself to ends of its own making. That is, a definite future which would go out and across, shared with others. Words and acts have their jointure in this ability to respond to each other and therefore to take responsibility. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Divya. It's hard to be after you because it was wonderful and we have lots of to discuss, so please stay because there is a cocktail after my acknowledgements. So here I want to thank all the people who made it possible. So the technical staff, the communication department, the administrative support, and all the French translators who are working hard all day. But also, big applause to all of them. the speakers and chairs, because we were lucky to have amazing people among us, and we were quite proud. It was a little bit difficult and chaotic to prepare this workshop because of a geopolitical situation and also the strikes in France. That seems to be like all the time. We should get used to it, I guess. And for our speakers, we thought that you will go back with a gift, which is the book Career and Family of the Nobel Prize winner Claudia Goldin, that I think, Matthias, like you quoted her. So it's just a book where she's taking an in-depth look at the diverse experience of college-educated women, like from a whole century to today, examining their aspiration and how there are barriers in terms of career, job, marriage, and children. And what is interesting is also the conclusion is like how we have to make fundamental changing on the way we work and how we value like the difference between caregiving, but work, we can extend it to how do we put the value into the work and into the meanings of what we are doing, right? And last but not least, my partners in crimes, like they are all amazing, they work very hard. So I would like you to like make a big applause to all of them because they did an amazing job. And because we want to be sure that you had a great experience, and I forgot something which is very important, is to thank actually the Paris Brain Institute, because they're really like supporting us. They're giving us all of the budget so we have an amazing video recording that then can be on YouTube and people can hear all of you, so we are very excited by that. So please make sure that you can, spread our YouTube channel for that. And this is why we have this QR code, so you can put your, what would you like us to talk about next time? And is there anything special, you would like us to do in 2 years from now? And if you were happy about the sessions and all the, speakers. And now I would like all the speakers who are still here and the organizing committee to come to the stage, because like this we can have a big final picture of all of us, if you would like to join me. Cheese. Jump.